I don't think there's going to be too many job applicants to replace Nasrallah's successor. Clearly, the IDF have the best possible intelligence you could imagine on the individuals, their movements, and how best to get at them. And I think this is not just the head of the organization, it's not just Nasrallah and his successor. We've also seen immense decapitation of Hezbollah, the pager attacks a short while ago and the explosive-laden radio attacks, plus numerous airstrikes against Hezbollah leaders, Beirut and elsewhere in Lebanon, have certainly done immense damage to the organization. I would be surprised if there's ever been a more comprehensive attack against a terrorist organization, or probably any other organization's leadership, as we've seen from the Israelis in the last few weeks. But I think so far the ground operation has done a huge amount of damage to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And that includes destroying tunnels, it includes destroying large quantities, and I mean very large quantities of ammunition, of rockets, of terrorist equipment, and the death of a large number, hundreds of terrorists have been killed inside southern Lebanon by the ground forces so far already. And I'm sure that the IDF would not have sent ground forces in if they could have done the job from the air, but there are a number of considerations, one of which is, of course, is that it's very hard to really deal effectively with ground forces, particularly dug in and underground and inside buildings, entirely from the air, both in terms of the identification of targets and in terms of their physical destruction. But the other factor, of course, is the ammunition. And obviously every airstrike depletes the IDF's ammunition supplies. And clearly Hezbollah have large quantities of rockets stored well north in Lebanon, including long-range rockets, which would have to be a higher priority for the Israeli Air Force than targets right along the border. So I think it's probably a combination of those things that have led the IDF to launch this ground operation. I think there's been devastating pressure against Hezbollah, both in terms of destroying their fighting capabilities and their leadership, and that has to be kept going. There's already reports at the moment of Hezbollah may be looking for a ceasefire, and this would be exactly the wrong time to allow that to happen. I think this is a time to drive home Israel's advantage and do as much damage as possible to Hezbollah as it can, while at the same time not discounting the possibility of Hezbollah being maybe voluntarily withdrawing from southern Lebanon into the north, further north, but putting in place mechanisms to ensure they can't return, and maybe even pushing towards the disarmament as far as possible of Hezbollah. That might be a pipe dream. I think the chances of them simply putting their hands up and surrendering are very low. But it's really only those kind of moves that should, I think, temper Israel's attacks on Hezbollah. And while they've got the upper hand as they have now, they need to keep hold of it. If they relax pressure on Hezbollah now, then what that does is to kick the can down the road instead of smashing the can. And it leaves the problem again to resurrect along the lines it has been for years now, to maybe a few weeks, months, or even years to come. So this is the ideal time now, I think. Hezbollah seriously weakened to not necessarily to finish them off. That may not be a possibility in this campaign within the limitations that Israel is imposing on itself, but certainly to really do such damage to them that they can no longer pose a direct threat particularly to the citizens of northern Israel, 65,000 of whom have been displaced from their homes now for a year. Well, we saw the response to the first series of ballistic missile, drone and cruise missile attacks back in April. And that was a very light response by Israel. It was striking Isfahan, I think, taking out a radar installation, which certainly showed Iran the capabilities Israel has against their most heavily defended place in Iran. But it clearly wasn't adequate, because we then saw the repeat about a week ago of firing about 180 ballistic missiles into Israel. So now I don't think Israel has any option now other than to deliver a devastating blow against Iran, directly against Iran. And that blow could come in a number of different ways. First of all, by hitting military targets, rocket launchers, weapons storage sites, IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, bases, taking out their commanders, taking out their fighters. That's the first, probably, and perhaps the most likely option that Israel will have in its response. Second, of course, is the potential to hit oil and gas installations. But that would be legitimate as well, because it's the oil and gas that provides Iran with the funds it needs to fight this war, to fight the war against Israel. And Israel has a right to, if it can, to remove those funds. That could also do very big damage to Iran. And finally, I think I would say the Iranian nuclear capability, that has to be dealt with at some point. It's nearing fruition. They're on the cusp of, I think, having the capability of delivering at least 10 nuclear bombs to Israel and elsewhere in the region, and potentially the world. And so that has to be dealt with. Whether that will be in this stage of Israel's response or will follow later, we'll have to see. Clearly, there's a need to be concerned. We've heard rhetoric from the Iranian government in the last few hours warning Israel that if it does respond as it's threatened to do, that there will be an even more devastating response against Israel. Well, that rhetoric needs to be taken into account, and the potential for that needs to be taken into account with Israel's air defenses. But you can't win a war, you can't even fight a war effectively if you're too worried about the enemy's response to what you're going to do. Clearly, it's got to be taken into account. And I would certainly hope that if a counter-attack comes from Iran after Israel has struck, then Israel's allies will join in again, as they've done on both previous occasions when Iran hit Israel, including the US forces, the British forces, and other allied forces, including Arab forces in the region. How much capability Iran has to really do significant damage to Israel is very hard to assess. Both of their previous attacks failed miserably. They did very limited damage. In the last attack, for example, a week ago, they managed only to kill one individual who was a Gazan, actually, who was living in Jericho. And beyond that, pretty limited damage, some damage to an airbase. But we don't know, really, at least I don't know, how much more capability Iran has to do severe damage to Israel. But Israel, unfortunately, have no choice than to deal with Iran now. And I think that, the scale of Israel's attack and the extent of the devastation that Israel wreaks on Iran will have some effect on Iran's retaliation. And of course, we shouldn't forget that the Iranian regime is fragile. There's a lot of resistance in Iran, a very large amount of resistance to the regime. And Israel's attack against Iran could have two effects. It could have the effect of hardening the support of the regime, as sometimes external attack does, or it could have the effect of destabilizing the regime even further. I think it certainly could. I'm sure Israel has the capability of dealing with the Ayatollah. Whether they would choose to do so is obviously a political decision by the government of Israel. But I'm sure, I have little doubt that they could. We've seen their extraordinary intelligence and strike capability, but including Hania in Tehran itself, in a protected area of Tehran, and of course the damage they've done to Nasrallah and other senior Hezbollah leaders. So I think they have that capability, and again, it's a political choice as to whether to do that.